You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and sincerest apologies today, guys, because I am simply just dying of allergies. The ragweed is literally about to kill me and end my life. I am fairly certain. I only hope that one of you listeners will pick up the torch and start a true crime podcast investigating my death. So apologies for being so wonky today, but we're going to get through it because I have some really interesting stuff. At least I find it interesting. So I hope that you do too. Today's episode is going to be about musicians who have committed some awful crime. I think that when you think about musicians or band members or singers who have done horrible things, I think that the general public has an immediate short list. I'm willing to bet also that R. Kelly is probably at the top of that list somewhere. I may actually turn this into a series, occasional series where we pick up a few more, but I'm going to be doing a handful. Plus, I know it's pretty likely that our general listener base is not familiar with a man by the name of GG Allin. But you are about to be. And I would also like to state for the record that I simply cannot afford to pay for other people's therapy bills. So if you are easily offended or grossed out very easily, I may just, do a hard pass in the GG Allin section if I were you. It's amazing how someone so vile became so notorious and legendary in music. So before we get into that, let's just get some brief housekeeping out of the way. You can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com. We Saw the Devil across all social media. And if you're loving the show or liking the show, you can always financially back it on Patreon. Our Patreon is patreon.com/We Saw the Devil. And for as little as $3 a month, you can get a cool wide variety of benefits, such as a private Facebook group, postcards, true crime gifts, a really, really awesome Facebook community for our patrons, and other things. Again, that's patreon.com/We Saw the Devil. And as always, guys, if you're liking the show, really enjoying it, and you're listening to us on iTunes, or even if you're not on iTunes, please take 30 seconds out of your day and leave a 5-star review. It really is probably the best thing that you can do for a show as a whole. And I'm not, again, talking just about mine. If you love a podcast, a 5-star review works wonders as far as sponsorships, support, marketing, and metrics. So if you have it in your heart, please leave that 5-star review. Not only for my show, but for any other shows that you love as well. This episode is dropping, and then also this week I have Lori Vallow episode part 2 of the movie review that Iris and Brittany joined me for. We had a lot of great, hilarious feedback from part 1. Thank you so much for listening. We had an absolute blast. So let's get into it, guys. Again, for today's episode, we're going to discuss musicians who have committed some major crimes. And what spawned the idea for this episode was a meme going around Facebook. I've seen it a handful of times, the circle that I kind of operate in. It's been passed around countless times. And it's just picture after picture, it's an album, of male musicians who have basically been accused of or convicted of rape or pedophilia. And I think all of us true crime junkies have a few names just, right, again, like I said earlier, right off the top of our heads, because there are so many. Unfortunately, with fame comes power and money, and it can do some pretty awful things. Again, not solely blaming it on that before people get a little testy. I'm just saying that it's kind of crazy, as you'll see in some of these stories, what fame and that kind of power that comes from it can do. Starting off, everyone knows Eric Clapton, right? If you grew up, anytime over the last 50 years, you know songs like Tears in Heaven. I was born in 1984. I remember seeing that countless times on VH1 as well as on the radio. That song was sadly about the death of his 4-year-old son. Most people know him as a guitar virtuoso. And back in the 1960s, right around the time of the mass counterculture movement and Woodstock, he was in a band called Cream. Cream broke up in 1968, and then Clapton waited 2 years later to 1970 and founded a band called Derek and the Dominoes. This band only lasted for 1 year due to infighting, obviously egos, and then the drummer, Jim Gordon, had a personality disorder. Eric Clapton was a notorious heroin addict, and it just overall, there was so much tension and so many fights going on that they broke up. However, Eric Clapton's greatest hit that he's ever done, Layla, which is probably his number one single, did actually come out of Derek and the Dominoes. So in that regard, the band was actually very influential. Jim Gordon, again, the drummer, was pretty much the primary cause of the demise of the group. He would drink large quantities of alcohol, become incredibly violent, both with his female lovers as well as with the band itself. So after Derek and the Dominoes dissolved, Jim Gordon went fairly quiet, off the rails, basically. And in 1983, he ended up driving to Hollywood, California, and the home of his mother, Osa, and he ended up bludgeoning her to death with a hammer and then attacked her with a butcher knife. During his trial, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was sentenced to 16 years to life, and he's been up for parole numerous times, but he just doesn't show up to his hearings. He has never shown up to a parole hearing. His last parole hearing was just 4 months ago back in March, and nope, didn't show up. He's now 75 years old, and he just simply wants to die in prison. He just does not want to leave prison. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't do anything. He's pretty much just decided to die there. And again, his legacy can be heard on such tracks as Layla, but also on arguably one of the most important songs in music history, John Lennon's Imagine. He actually played drums on that original track. Here is this guy that most people haven't heard of, but is likely one of the most famous, in terms of listens, drummer probably in music history. Ended up bludgeoning and stabbing his own mother to death. And next up, this is a guy that I knew nothing about whatsoever. And so I actually decided to delve in and read about him, the court, the documentation. I know we have a lot of listeners from Britain, the UK, so I'm sorry it's taken me so long to even read up on this, but I'm doing my best here. Paul Francis Gadd, known to the world as British singer Gary Glitter, is yet another vile piece. He achieved international fame in the 1970s and 80s for ridiculous outfits and platform shoes. And let's just fast forward. He had major success in the 70s and 80s. He looked absolutely just freaking ridiculous. And whatever, that's all you need to know about that. Let's fast forward to 1997. Glitter dropped off a laptop to a repair shop in Bristol, and as the technician got into his computer, he found, you guessed it, a whole cache of child pornography. All in all, Glitter possessed more than 4,000 child pornography images and videos. 4,000. More than. He went to trial and was sentenced to 4 months in prison and was forced to register as a sex offender. But he fled on his yacht. Seriously, he immediately set sail for Spain and actually spent a few years there living under a false identity, hanging out with the locals under that false identity, and also abusing children. Eventually, his cover was blown, and he ended up going to Cuba and then back to Cambodia. He settled in Cambodia, but again, he was arrested on sex offense charges, because people worldwide do tend to frown on child sex abuse. After he was deported from Cambodia, he ended up settling in Vietnam, but his troubles weren't over after moving there. He made it to the police radar when other patrons in a club saw him groping a young waitress, like very young waitress. So they dispatched police to his house. And as police were questioning a person at his home, they discovered a 15-year-old girl living there. They questioned her and discovered that she had been having sex with Glitter and that Glitter had been having sex with children at his flat, at his apartment. So he was arrested and charged. And he was actually up against a firing squad for child sex crimes. However, Glitter paid off the victims' families because, they were vastly living in squalor. So he paid off the families, and then they appealed to prosecutors that he should just receive time in prison. And so he did. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. and he served his time. Now, he was released in 2008 and immediately deported to London on a flight. And he lived freely in the UK during this time, but his old crimes came back to haunt him in 2015 when there was renewed interest in the case of Jimmy Savile. There was a renewed interest in Jimmy Savile. He was a notorious British TV and radio personality. He was friends with members of government, parliament, huge actors, actresses, royalty. He was an absolute icon. An investigation into Jimmy Savile uncovered a vast number of child sex crimes. And Glitter would frequently go on or canoodle with Jimmy Savile. And so people started coming forward about Gary Glitter as well. So on June 5th, 2014, Glitter was charged with 8 counts of sexual offenses committed against 2 girls aged 12 to 14 between the years of 1977 and 1980. On January 19th of 2015, he appeared in court, accused of 7 counts of indecent assault, 1 count of attempted rape, and 2 other sexual offenses between those girls during 1975 and 1980. He was accused of sexually assaulting 2 girls, ages 12 and 13, after inviting them backstage to his dressing room. He was also charged with attempting to rape a girl under the age of 10 after having crept into her bed. The trial lasted 2.5 weeks, and he was convicted of attempted rape, 4 counts of indecent assault, and 1 of having sex with a girl under the age of 13. He was acquitted of the 3 other counts. He would later be sentenced to 16 years in prison, and he has been serving his time at HMP The Vern. And a bit of controversy, he's still alive, and a bit of controversy actually happened last year during the pandemic, during COVID-19 lockdown. Due to his age, Gary Glitter was one of a group of prisoners who was actually eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, and he got it. And what that means is that Gary Glitter, notorious pedophile rapist, child rapist, actually got the vaccine before almost all of his victims did. And that caused a lot of public outcry and disgust, and with good reason. But likewise, you can't really have a pandemic take off in prison, can you? And it's actually kind of amazing, the concept of separating art from the artist. I mean, people have been trash since the dawn of time, right? People have been complete trash since the dawn of time for one reason or another. So can you personally separate art from the artist? Think of your favorite artist, and let's say he raped someone, or he murdered someone, or committed child sex crimes. Would you still listen to his work? Because there are countless artists operating today that have done those things, either spent time in prison or served their time and are back into public view. One of those people is Victor Salva. He's not a musician. He is a film director. He directed basically all the Jeepers Creepers. He actually raped a young boy. In 1988, he was actually convicted of sexual misconduct with one of his film's underage stars. The boy was 12 years old. He sexually abused this child multiple times. There was actually video of the crime itself. And when police investigated and raided his home, they found many magazines and videos containing child pornography. So he ended up pleading guilty to lewd and lascivious conduct, oral sex with a person under 14, and procuring a child in order to film pornography. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and only served 15 months. And he ended up completing his parole in 1992. And then he continued making films. So The Nature of the Beast, Powder, whom everyone knows, remember the movie Powder? He directed that after he raped a child and spent time in prison. He did Rites of Passage, Jeepers Creepers 1, 2, and 3, Dark House, Rosewood Lane. He's done a handful of films even after raping a child and spending time in prison for it. And people still continue to watch the Jeepers Creepers horror franchise. I just cannot bring myself to support financially someone who was convicted, even in the past, even though they served their time, with crimes of that manner. Boy George, whom all of you obviously know, did you know that he actually imprisoned a male escort, handcuffed him to a wall, beat him with chains, and then threatened to rape him? He was sentenced to 15 months in jail and only served 4 months. Now, he has since come out and admitted to doing it, but he refuses to apologize, saying that he was a drug addict during that time and going through a psychotic break. So he says that he has nothing to apologize for. It wasn't actually him. Narcissistic and vile. In the 1970s, David Bowie had sex with an underage child and also faced allegations. And then in 1980, Don Henley, the lead singer of the Eagles, was arrested when police found a drugged and half-naked 16-year-old girl in his home. He was only fined $2,000 and spent 2 years on probation. So let's discuss the baby groupie scene of the early 1970s. Everyone knows what a groupie is, right? So the baby groupie scene was primarily in the 1970s, and they were a group of young or teenage girls who would frequent bars and clubs on LA's Sunset Strip. They used fake IDs, they got all dressed up, and they basically just wanted to go to music, rock shows. And this was a very open and allowed secret. Bouncers, everyone even knew that these girls were children, despite the age of consent being 18 in California. And Lori Maddox and Sable Starr were perhaps the two most prolific women from the baby groupie scene. And in terms of music history, this was the golden age for the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. You had David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Iggy Pop, Jimmy Page. The absolute titans of the music industry would frequently be on the Strip. So Lori Maddox met David Bowie when she was 14 years old, and she and her best friend, Sable Starr, went to his hotel room for dinner after one of his shows. Lori lost her virginity to David Bowie, and then also in the same night, in the same bed, Bowie basically rolled over and then had sex with her 15-year-old best friend, and he knew their age. A few months later, Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page called Lori to introduce himself. She recounts in a later interview that it was very startling to her because, hi, I just got a phone call from, quite arguably one of the biggest, most famous people in all of music in the world. And while she was in a club late one night, Led Zeppelin's manager actually approached her and said, "Young lady, you're coming with me," and grabbed her arm and took her to a nearby hotel room. And Jimmy Page was waiting inside for her. They ended up having sex even though she was 14 years old and Jimmy Page was 28. And Lori Maddox would go on to say that they fell madly in love and dated, but I think we know what that's actually called. And she ended up dumping Jimmy Page when she found him sleeping with Bebe Buell, who was the teenage lover to Aerosmith's Steven Tyler. And Bebe would actually go on to be the mother of Liv Tyler, actress and model. And she just hung around with absolutely everyone. Here is a clip from Lori Maddox later on. "I remember being 17 and hanging out at the record plant in LA. I was friends with the owner and everybody recorded there. I saw 3 of the Beatles with Mick Jagger and Stevie Wonder having this great jam session. But then Mick started fighting with McCartney or Lennon over who would sing on a particular song. Mick got pissed off. He took me to one of the bondage-themed bedrooms that the studio had. Mick said, 'Let's go fuck and get high.' We did blow all night and talked and hung out until the morning. We tried to have sex all night, but at a certain point, he just couldn't get hard anymore. We were both very high. Another time, Mick had me on a bathroom floor while Bianca was getting ready for surgery. The sex was very consensual." Now, Lori Maddox has since changed her tune, saying that she was, in fact, exploited by men. She later said in an interview that one of the times as an adult, we're talking decades later, that Jimmy Page came to Los Angeles, to her town, to her suburb, Lori Maddox actually met up with him. She recalls, quote, "He said to me, 'Lori, we were both children back then,' and I felt like telling him at least one of us was." And Sable Starr, Maddox's best friend, also did a lot of different things with a lot of different musicians. She also made it into music legend when Iggy Pop wrote about her in his song Look Away, one of his biggest. The lyrics go, "I slept with Sable when she was 13. Her parents were too rich to do anything. She walked her way around LA till a New York doll carried her away." She also had a very long list of rock stars and musicians that she ended up sleeping with. Iggy Pop probably being the most serious out of all of those. Rock stars and sometimes illegal or explicit sex obviously go hand in hand. So let's move on to a different kind of crime. I'd like to talk about the lead singer of one of my favorite bands. As everyone knows, I love French everything. My degree is in French language and literature. I lived in Paris for a while. A lot of my music is French. And when I was in my early 20s, I discovered a band called Noir Désir, and I really fell in love with them. And then the lead singer murdered his mistress. Bertrand Cantat was basically the Jim Morrison of France and French rock in the 1990s. Think of him as basically Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder, and so on, like literal superstar. He was married with 2 children and constantly touring on the road with his band Noir Désir. And he began having an affair with acting royalty Marie Trintignant. And in July of 2004, at a show in Lithuania, the couple were in their hotel room. Marie apparently received a flirtatious text message from her ex-husband, and Bertrand went into a white, jealous rage. He began to rain down blows on her head and face, and she ended up going non-responsive. Police were called hours later, and she was rushed to the hospital, but she ended up passing away after slipping into a coma during surgery. Cantat had beaten her so brutally that he fractured her facial bones and actually caused brain damage. And he went on trial in Lithuania. He was up against 15 years in prison, but he was only sentenced to just 8 years and served only a little over 4, because French law dictates that a criminal with good behavior can serve just half of their actual sentence. It was really super disturbing because during his trial, he basically called it a crime of passion and was like, yeah, I slapped her. And he actually reenacted how he hit her multiple times. But the thing about it, he said that he slapped her a couple times, and forensic investigators determined that he had literally punched her with basically all of his strength 19 times in the face and head. But that's not the only woman in Cantat's life who passed away. His wife, Christina Rady, a respected Hungarian arts director, hanged herself in 2010, just 2.5 years after Cantat was released from jail for beating his mistress to death. She actually called her parents 6 months before her suicide and left a voice message. And in this voice message, she actually spoke to the psychological and physical violence to which she said her husband was subjecting her. She said, quote, a series of events worse than those of 2003 was taking place, and that on several occasions she had narrowly, quote, escaped the very worst. And then also, quote, if anything happened, that there would be witnesses to testify. Since Bertrand Cantat was released from prison, he went back to making music with his band Noir Désir. And he and Christina Rady, after he was released from prison, actually did try to make their marriage work. And he still physically, emotionally, and mentally abused her. So Noir Désir had a little bit of success after his release from prison, but they did end up breaking up. And he actually ended up going into a semi-successful solo run. He sold a lot of records, but also he was not really allowed to play anywhere like shows or festivals because the general public would actually petition the venues and promotions to have him kicked off of the bill. Honestly, he's pretty much one of the biggest dickbags in all of music. Every time he does an interview and he talks about his mistress, Marie Trintignant, he's like, I loved her so much. And he ends up finding a way to make it all solely about him. And in regards to his wife's eventual suicide, she told a lot of people that his band, Noir Désir, actually knew that he was physically abusive, violent, as well as she was planning to kill herself. Apparently, his band knew that she committed suicide and planned to and did nothing to help and or stop her. All of them are just terrible, terrible, terrible people. And he is still currently making music. Moving on, we have Ian Watkins, the Welsh lead singer of the band Lostprophets. I'm not going to get into this one because this is probably a full episode type of case, but he is quite possibly the largest piece of shit in music history. For all intents and purposes, I will just paraphrase. Ian Watkins used his celebrity status to groom women in order to obtain access to their children. And then from there, he would demand that the mothers do things to their children on video for his own gratification, and or make them physically available to him off tour. If you want to read more about this case or what exactly happened, the entire full court document and transcript is available online. Major, major, major content and trigger warning on that. It is absolutely vile. He ended up going to prison in 2013 after admitting to 13 sex crimes, including the attempted rape of a baby. And he was given 29 years and will be eligible parole coming up here shortly in 2029. But let's talk about arguably one of the grossest. And his name is GG Allin. And I realize that most of our audience likely has no idea who GG Allin even is, so let me introduce you via words from Fat Mike, the lead singer of the band NoFX. And this is in regards to a show that Fat Mike actually ended up witnessing. Quote, apparently, GG prepared by drinking whiskey and taking X-Lax the entire day. The band started playing, and as soon as GG took the stage, he took a shit that came out like water, and it hit the floor and pulled out in a circle. He got down on his knees, sucked it up, and spit it out onto the crowd. I was behind Jello Biafra, so I grabbed onto him and used him as a human shield to guard myself from this. I would say that at least half the crowd left right then. 10 people threw up and went into the other room. So now, GG and his band were playing and everyone was at least 10 feet back. And that was the first song. Now there was more room, so he threw a bunch of glass on the floor and began to roll on it. He grabbed this blonde girl from the audience and was just on top of her. She was just screaming. It wasn't fun, it wasn't consensual, but nobody wanted to touch him. Eventually, people were trying to pull him off of her, but there was blood, shit, and glass everywhere. So they finally got him off, and then he went around the audience and started hitting people with the base of the mic stand. Then a girl who was into it came on stage, and he just kicked her in the fucking face, right in the jaw. She went home with him that night after he went to the hospital. One of his knees that night was so cut that every time he took a step, blood would continually squirt out, and it was absolutely terrifying. GG Allin was born Jesus Christ Allin in 1956 and grew up in Groveton, New Hampshire. And yes, his actual legal name was Jesus Christ. His father, Merle, was a religious fanatic, and his family lived in a log cabin with no electricity, no air conditioning or anything, and no running water. His dad was an absolute and complete psychopath. He would frequently threaten to kill his entire family and even kept freshly dug graves in their basement to prove that he was ready to do so basically at any time. His mom, Arleta, ended up divorcing and leaving Merle, taking the family to Vermont. And she did end up changing Jesus Christ's name to Kevin, but the name GG had already stuck. And if you thought he had a chance at life, you would be wrong. He grew up a very violent child who frequently threw tantrums. And eventually he became a criminal all throughout high school. He would sell drugs. He would frequently wear women's clothing to just basically piss off authorities. He would break into people's homes, steal cars, robbed a few businesses. And after graduating high school in the early 80s, he decided to focus on music. And he ended up hopping around between dozens and dozens of punk bands in the 1980s. Now, you may have heard of GG Allin, but have no idea who he is. And like I said and described in the opening quote by Fat Mike from NoFX, he was notorious for defecating on stage. He would take X-Lax hours before a show, get up on stage, and shit himself. Yes, he would literally just shit himself. He would usually be completely nude except for a jockstrap. He would wear the same jockstrap for 4 or 5 shows at a time after literally crapping himself. And sometimes he would actually eat his own feces and then spit it out into the crowd. Other times he would just roll around in it and then jump into the crowd and bounce off of them, or chase them down and rub himself on them. And he became notorious for this, not only this, but also for assault. He was also very vocally pro-rape, and he claimed to have raped both men and women. He would attack members of the audience, and it basically didn't matter if you were a man or a woman. He would cold cock members and listeners, people who showed up at his shows at random. He would hit them with microphone stands. He would urinate on them. I mean, it was literally all out chaos, and he became absolutely notorious for it. He would also take beer bottles, break them, and then cut himself all over his body on stage. So by the end of the night, he was basically a bloodied, feces and urine covered mess. And he landed in jail many times due to public indecency. Somewhere I read 52 arrests on his record. But perhaps his biggest crime was what he did to a female concert goer in 1989. So he was accused of rape and assault after he tortured a fan that he met at one of his performances in Detroit. On September 12, 1989, he was arrested for and eventually convicted of assault with intent to do great bodily harm less than murder. 5 months before that, he had met a woman by the name of Leslie Morgan at a show in Detroit. This woman came to the venue and she walked to the back and she said, "I want to meet GG Allin." And the promoter there said, "No, ma'am, you do not. You do not want to meet him. It is not safe for you to meet him," because everyone knew what he was like, and he turned her away. He went backstage and she was already there. And she was topless sitting on GG Allin's lap. And she was very happy. It was very, very consensual. So GG Allin played the show and the band ended up staying outside of Detroit for the next couple weeks. She ended up showing up to this house party. According to the promoter, this woman came in, showed up at the house party, and basically asked GG Allin to tie her to a bed and have him and the whole band rape her. Now, the band itself did not, but GG Allin did. And by the end of a few days, he had burned her with cigarette butts, urinated on her, put peanut butter inside of her vagina, cut half-moon shapes with the jagged edge of a beer can on the bottom of her breasts, had her deep throat a sharp knife, and then also inserted a knife into her vagina. The abuse lasted at least 2 days, culminating one morning when she would not wake up. She was completely non-responsive. And what does GG Allin do to try to wake her up? Does he call the police? Does he, get somebody to come check on her? He lights her on fire. He literally lit her left leg on fire, causing a 3rd-degree burn, which actually ended up requiring a skin graft. Police are called. She gets to the hospital, and she says that it was imprisonment and rape. He said that it was rough sex and purely consensual. The thing about it is that many, many witnesses actually witnessed her telling him and the band that she wanted to have consensual sex. However, because of his reputation, no one actually wanted to back him up in court. No one wanted to support his claims. So the state of Michigan agreed with Leslie Morgan, and he ended up spending 16 months in prison at a Michigan Department of Corrections facility in Washtenaw County. If you think he's vile already, it basically continued through prison. During his time in prison, he actually journaled constantly. And you can actually buy a book of his journal entries if you're into, disgusting things. But he claimed that he actually masturbated over 100 times in his first 30 days in prison. And here's the true crime tie-in here. He was also very close friends with serial killer John Wayne Gacy. He actually went to visit him frequently in prison. They became, I'm not shitting you, best friends. He even commissioned a painting by Gacy to be used as cover art for one of his albums. And here's a fun little side story, fun random fact. Have you ever seen any of the following movies? The Hangover, Due Date, Joker. Odds are 99.9% that you've seen at least one, if not all of those. So you've seen a movie directed by the acclaimed director, Todd Phillips. So when Todd was in film school at NYU, it was during the reign of GG Allin. GG was based out of New York City and was huge in the underground scene. And the film students and anyone in kind of the counterculture, alternative or underground scenes, especially punk scenes, were completely enthralled by him. Equal parts enthralled, but also completely, thoroughly disgusted. So he and a couple of his fellow film students, approached GG Allin and asked if they could do a documentary on him. He agreed. This group of young college students followed around this drug-addicted, poop-covered, woman-raping psychopath, and they actually ended up getting to know him. The budget, because they were traveling so frequently, started to get pretty inflated, so Todd Phillips believed in this project so much that he actually dropped out of NYU to finance it. But then he realized that he needed help. So he did what basically any normal person would do. He wrote a letter to John Wayne Gacy himself. And John Wayne Gacy actually called him collect from prison and replied. And here's Todd Phillips discussing what happened when he reached out to Gacy. He said, quote, "Even though the movie wasn't made yet, I go, maybe you can paint it and we'll send it to you and you can sign it and then we'll sell them as limited edition posters." And so Gacy called me collect from jail. It was fucking crazy. It was John Wayne Gacy, same way GG Allin called. And we talked and he said, "I'll do it for $50 for art supplies in jail and a compromising photo of yourself." I sent him a $50 money order and a photo of myself that my roommate took on the roof of our building on 99 Avenue B. I wasn't naked, but it was very hawkish. And I sent it to him and he painted the posters. This was a process because he was in jail. He made this painting of Gigi, which is great. We made these big posters and then the plan was we made 1,000 posters and shipped them back to him for him to sign and number, but then the prison wouldn't let him sign and number them, so we ended up just doing it ourselves. We sold them for $15 each in the back of Maximum Rock and Roll and Flipside and all these magazines. We ended up making about $10,000 or $11,000, so John Wayne Gacy is really the executive producer. If you are interested in watching this insane documentary by Todd Phillips, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's actually really fascinating. It's disgusting, but it's super fascinating. And it's currently available for free on Tubi or also on YouTube for $1.99. And guys, I am not kidding you when I say that this guy was absolutely insane. Those closest to him say that, I mean, obviously armchair diagnosis, right? But everyone close to him said that he had to have been either very heavily bipolar or actually schizophrenic based on the behaviors that he had. Say, for example, Todd Phillips and his film crew. GG Allin would actually assault you just out of nowhere. Like, you could be sitting, not even at a show, just like in his apartment, and then all of a sudden he would just start flipping out and assault you, start beating you. So Todd Phillips actually had to make a deal with him and get big orange stickers, like the kind that you have at yard sales, big orange stickers, and he handed them out to his crew and said, "GG, see these orange stickers? You can't assault anybody with an orange that's wearing an orange sticker." And multiple times it shows, and also just while recording, generic footage, GG went to assault them. And then they quickly showed that orange sticker and he never actually touched them. So by 1990, GG Allin was constantly threatening to kill himself and promised to do it at a show at Halloween one year. Fans at this point were basically just buying tickets to see if he would actually do it. However, he didn't. He actually ended up accidentally and ironically dying of a heroin overdose while sitting next to his 17-year-old girlfriend, who, by the way, Todd Phillips reported that she had 2 black eyes from his daily physical abuse. His funeral was basically what you would expect. It was a completely underground affair. Only his biggest fans attended. And GG actually, and this is disgusting, GG actually had it written into his will that he did not want his body to be washed before burial. So the photo of him in the casket is literally how he was from the night before at his final performance, caked in blood, urine, and feces. And at his funeral, people were pouring Jim Beam into his mouth, urinating into his mouth, all while he was literally dead, sitting there laying there in the coffin. And then they partied all night long. It's absolutely crazy to me that he has become so notorious. He made really, really, really bad music. If you just look up GG Allin lyrics, you can see, it was just racist, non-politically correct. It was misogynistic. It was just absolutely, the lyrics were awful. He was awful, awful human, awful everything. I don't even know how to end this segment or close this segment, guys. I've been guilty myself of watching a handful of weird short documentaries on him and his life. There are a handful of them actually on YouTube. And he was an absolute clear psychopath, like 0% chance of anything. He was an absolute psychopath. But it makes for a very, 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 very fascinating watch or read if you're looking for a documentary on something that is outside of your usual. So this is part 1 of this. I think I'm going to do a whole series of these because, guys, there's a lot of material to pull from here. So I think just picking out a few cases at a time and doing a series on this is going to be a fun time. But that is it for today, guys. Thank you for listening. Don't forget, you can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com. We Saw the Devil across all social media. And if you love the show, like the show, and want to join our Patreon or financially back the show, you can do so at patreon.com/WeSawTheDevil. And as for little as $3 a month, you can get cool stuff like merch, stickers, t-shirts, postcards from around the country, true crime gifts, and a private Facebook group. Next episode coming out will be part 2, the final piece of our review of Doomsday Mom. I wanted to get part 1 out, get this out, and then I will finally close out that review. Again, Brittany and Iris joined me to talk about it, and we had an absolute blast, so we will close that up in the next episode. And then I have a very, very, very special surprise for the next episode after. Thank you again for listening, guys. Again, apologies for my allergies. Hopefully they will be knocked out shortly. Until next crime.